Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is rather unusual. So many people are here on time. It's Washington, D.C., and it's raining. And since I just got off a conference call with somebody who's stuck in traffic up on K Street, I commend all of you for your ability to manage. What is it now, the 15th straight day of rain we've had here? So it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here. I'm Jeff Helsing, the Associate Vice President for Education and Training at the United States Institute of Peace. And we are happy to, you cannot hear me. I may not even have the mic on. No, it's on. I will just speak louder. Thank you. The Institute is one of the many partners of the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Forum, and we've been happy to host a number of the sessions here, and we will do so again in September, where unlike this one, which had to come together a little bit I won't say last minute, but we'll say with a few fits and starts. The one in September will be focused on youth, and we're already pulling that program together. So I hope all of you can join us then. Today we are going to focus on a topic that's very much on the minds of many practitioners and policymakers, not only in Washington, but also around the world. It's becoming an increasing area of focus in terms of research. One of the areas that we're addressing here at the U.S. Institute of Peace is the topic of resilience, trying to understand what are the key factors that help communities and societies become better able to resist the pull of, the lure of, if you will, groups that are engaging in violent extremism. And some interesting sort of work is emerging around this area, and we hope over the next 6 months to a year to really be able to come out with some really evidence-based research where we can start creating some real ideas of what the links are, what the factors are between how a society or how a community is organized, the nature of its leadership, the nature of its relationships, can help really create means to resist violent extremism. So what we're going to focus on today is really two particularly interesting aspects of this question. The first is the role of, or the increasing role of, social media and the links that it creates and the challenges that it presents. Social media is one of those areas where there's sort of two sides of the same coin, one negative and one positive, but certainly the reach of communications and the ability of individuals and organizations to reach into communities regardless of isolation, at least geographically, is significantly increased. And what does that mean? What are the challenges in that regard? And then we also want to add sort of another layer to this, and that is the increasing role of women in organized violent extremism. What does that mean? What are we seeing? And what does some of the research begin to tell us? And so with that, we have three very distinguished panelists who are really focused both in terms of developing programs and doing research in these areas. And I will just introduce them one by one, and then we will go in order to hear their presentations, and then we will end with a question and answer session. So first, to my immediate left and to your right, is Rabia Chowdhury, who is a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow here at USIP, where she is doing research on the intersection of religion and violent extremism. She comes to USIP from the New America Foundation, where she's been an international security fellow, where she developed and led a CVE community project in partnership, interestingly enough, with Google, Facebook, and Twitter. She's also the founder of the Safe Nation Collaborative, which is a CVE training firm. So she's really been addressing this issue from a number of different perspectives, and she has very good ties into the corporate world and those who are really engaged in communications or enhanced communication and social media technology. Then we have Michael Shipler, who is the Regional Director of Asia Programs at the Search for Common Ground, one of the key partners for the forum. And Michael oversees program offices in Indonesia, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Timor-Leste. And Michael's been engaged in peace building for well into 2 decades. And he's been engaged in programs focused on youth, media, civil military affairs, and governance. And he's going to talk about sort of the increasing role of social media as he's witnessed it in his program support and work for Search, particularly in the Asian context. See, he, like Robbie, have a particular interest in and have experience with Pakistan. And then finally, to my far left is Lieutenant Colonel Kathleen Turner, who is a public affairs officer in the United States Army. She has over 20 years of service and is currently the U.S. Army War College Fellow here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior coming to USIP, she was the public affairs advisor to the 38th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, now retired General Ray Odierno. And she managed and developed his communications, particularly both internally and with external media, for over 3 years. But she's had a long and distinguished career in public affairs in the Army, including communications planning and advising senior officers on public affairs strategy. So she's taken this past year to really delve into communications strategy related to CVE with a particular focus on the increasing role of women. So with that, like I'm sure you are, looking forward to hearing our panelists. So Fabio, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Is this mic on? Okay. Let me pull this up and we'll get to that now. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It was a toss-up whether I was going to make it through the rain and traffic as well. And I want to apologize for how I sound. I'm a little bit under the weather, and I'm also a little bit medicated right now. So, but I'm awake. So, I want to first give a little bit of background about my work in CVE, and so you can understand like the perspective that I have come at this work with. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. I have been for the last 5 years, to the extent that you can be a CVE practitioner, and for the last 15 years, an advocate really deep in the grassroots of the American Muslim community. So, you know, I come at this work from a community advocate lens, but also, most importantly, I come at it as being part of the community that is really mostly impacted, not just in the U.S. by CVE policy, but also obviously overseas by the actions of violent extremists. And so it is a major concern for me because of the direct connection that I have to many of these issues, how they impact my community, my families, my places of worship, my family overseas. My family happens to be from Pakistan. And I was born on a street that a few years ago, for the first time in the history of his country, was attacked by terrorists. So that's how deep they've gotten into some of the places that were previously very peaceful in Pakistan. I want to talk a little bit about about the work that I did at the New America Foundation before coming here. I've only been here a couple of months, so I'm new at USIP, and I am as interested as everybody else in seeing like what my research here will finally yield. But I'll be back in a year, hopefully, to talk about that. But at New America Foundation, for about 2.5 years, I ran a program that basically provided social media advocacy training to Muslim activists and communities across the country. And this was, of course, in direct response to the increasing use of social media by violent extremist groups, not just to disseminate their messaging, but also, most troublesome was the recruitment of Western Muslims to come join them or to perpetrate acts here in the United States or in other Western countries. So the question was then that what can some of these private sector companies do, some of the tech companies, and what is their response to this? And that was the question the government posed. And overwhelmingly, these companies said, listen, we're not in the business of censorship, but we are in the business of helping to promote better content. And so what we can do is we can provide media training, social media trainings to the communities that are being directly impacted. So we, over the course of 2.5 years, conducted trainings in about 9 different cities. We trained about 500 activists, organizations, representative of about 150 of the major and minor Muslim organizations across the country. I would say at least a good 70 to 80% of all of the well-known Muslim organizations somehow had this training given to them over these 9 trainings. So here's what was interesting about the experience, some of the learning that I was able to glean from it. Number one, even Muslims who are very, very engaged on community issues have very little idea what's happening on social media. And I want to tie this back to, the recruitment of women in particular at some point, but just bear with me. What's happening with social media? People have no idea. First of all, because if you are an American Muslim and you decide, well, I want to see what's happening on social media, let me go see what Boko Haram is up to or what Al-Shabaab is tweeting today, you might end up on a list you don't want to be on. So people are very careful about how they're using internet and social media. They don't want to end up under the lens of law enforcement, and so they're very much avoid it. Parents and communities have no idea. Religious leaders, imams, they have no idea that young people can get on their smartphones and with 15 minutes they can be tweeting with somebody who is an ISIS recruiter or supporter or posing to be one. So there's very low information. There's very little information on this subject, period. The second issue that really stands in the way of giving this priority in communities is the fact that after 9/11, American Muslims have taken a very defensive stance in terms of civil liberties, and they find CVE to be an encroachment on their civil liberties. And there are lots of different reasons for that. So the primary focus of Muslims in the West has been civil rights, fighting Islamophobia, fighting anti-Muslim bigotry, and that has been the primary focus. Violent extremism, radicalization, CVE, these are very low priority on their list. Most people will say these are not relevant to our lives. These issues are not relevant to our lives. And if you say they are, that means that you are, you're making presumptions about us that are really incorrect and troublesome. One thing that I also learned, and Jeff had mentioned that I also am the founder of an organization called the Safe Nation Collaborative. And Safe Nation was founded about 5 years ago. And what we do with Safe Nation is we provide CVE training to law enforcement and to communities, all on a local level. So if you have a local sheriff's department and you have 5 mosques in the jurisdiction, what we try to do is provide similar trainings to all of them. So they actually just have the awareness of what's happening online. And many times even local law enforcement doesn't know that. As I was doing this work, I did a lot of work with the youth groups that were part of the mosques and the communities. And this is not, I don't have empirical research on this or data on this, but I can tell you anecdotally, in at least 4 or 5 different situations, I conducted a kind of an exercise with youth groups and Muslim youth groups, ages 16 to 19, maybe 15 to 19, where we did the identity exercises. And it's very simple. You just draw a tree with branches, and on every branch you name a part of your identity. So if I was drawing my tree, I might say mother, sister, Pakistani, Muslim, American, whatever. And so I did this repeatedly, and I can tell you in about 90% of the cases, and these are kids who were born and raised in the United States, would not have the word American on their identity tree. I saw this in one community, not a single one of the 20 students had the word American, and I thought this was fascinating. And I didn't understand why. And that got me very interested on the issue of Muslim identity in the West. And I realized that, this is kind of the crux of the issue, I think, when it comes to things like recruitment, marginalization, and the push and pull factors that we talk about when we're like, how do people become radicalized, whatever that means? How do people decide that, or how do young people decide that, I'm going to get up and I'm going to leave my community, my family, everything I've ever known, and go to a country that I have no ties with to fight a war that I know nothing about? How does this happen? So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. And this is from a security debrief, their website. And some of the research shows this line right here: the second most commonly mentioned risk factor, and that's for radicalization, is a youth identity crisis. The desire for structured identity coupled with a weak parent-child relationship, which is also very interesting because that's similar in other contexts too, with right-wing extremism and other kinds of similar phenomena, can make young people susceptible to a recruiter's message. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about identity. Now, this is also this is from a CNN article. Why is ISIS so successful at recruiting? And I actually want to push back in terms of the framing there, because I think in the U.S. context, at least, ISIS has not been so successful. I think it's been fairly low recruitment. But nonetheless, Richard Baird of Sufan Group said that for many, it boils down to a lack of a sense of identity or belonging. Okay. So what shapes our identity? What shapes the identity of any community, of youth, right? Particularly in this context, Muslims in the West. Well, I wanted to see what kind of messages violent extremists, and ISIS in particular, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, who are really, really adept at social media on a level that I haven't seen any other organization be proficient with. What kind of messages are they giving specifically to young people that might actually be directed at this issue of an identity crisis, and why are they resonating? And so the images I'm going to show you right now, they weren't prepared for this this panel. They are part of an exercise I do in communities just to show people how does ISIS talk to your kids, and why does it work? So you have most of these pictures are taken directly from ISIS Instagram accounts and other distributions they've done. So this is a really interesting image, and I think this image evokes power, right? Romance, something, right? It's a beautiful image, right? It's almost artistic. It's not brutal. It's not bloody. There is something very, romantically, just, adventurous about it. You've got this image. Why? Why would they do that? Right? And there's others where they have Nutella, right? Kittens. The internet loves kittens. Terrorists love kittens, right? Look how much they love kittens. Right here. Look, they've got restaurants there. They've got tablecloths. They eat together. One thing I want you to notice in these images, which are are coming directly from their Instagram accounts, I don't see any religious messaging, right? They're not giving scripture. They're not giving religious, any kind of saying, oh, the Quran says this or the Prophet says this. They're just saying, look at what does this mean to you? This is speaking specifically to a demographic, right? Young people on social media. We respond in Jannah. So I think some of these these images are really interesting. The ones of them in kind of combat mode, right? This. Now, there's a distinct difference between these kinds of images and the images that we got for years from, let's say, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, right? Can anybody name a difference here? What makes this very distinct? Or well, let's go back here 1 second. These two images from what we've seen before. I know I can't be the only one who laughed when I saw Al-Qaeda fighters swinging from monkey bars and doing training exercises that just didn't seem legitimate. That they had no uniform, right? They look organized. They look professional. This is the military. These are not just insurgents or terrorists. These are people who are part of something real. They're part of a state. States have militaries, right? So these are, even as horrifying as this image is, because we know exactly what happened afterwards, to young people, this looks like these people know what they're doing, right? They've got it together. They're creating something real. Okay, they're not just haphazard. And then you have women. Now this is also interesting. Okay, these women are in full niqab. So how is this attractive to a young Muslim woman in the West who's grown up, let's say, in very open circumstances? She's not forced to dress like this. But why would this resonate with her? And I'll explain to you why I think why. Um, and these are the kinds of messages that they're given by other girls and women who've gone over there being co-wives or best friends. So, we're all like friends here. And we're going to get into the why. So these are the kinds of images that they're getting from recruitment. Now let's look at their context, right? And I have a teenager. I also have a 7-year-old. And I'm raising my kids in a post 9/11 America. On the other hand, these are the images they're getting from Western media, okay? These guys, to me, I mean, this is called the Rage Muslim. This is actually a meme in the Muslim community, the Rage Muslim. So they, again, there's more Rage Muslims. A lot of Muslims are very angry, but guess what? They're actually impotent. They can't do anything. They can just be angry. More Rage Muslims. These are all from Western media sources. Look at this. These are very powerful images to a young Muslim, right? Because this is how they are seeing themselves reflected in the media here. This is the only time they're seeing their images. Somebody they can maybe relate to, even though they shouldn't, right? So this person is completely impotent, disempowered. And what about women? How are Muslim women depicted in the media? Well, those ISIS women might have been fully covered, but they were organized and they had guns. They're empowered. These women are not empowered, right? Look at this, right? This is what our young people are seeing um, in the countries they're growing up in. And so there is absolutely a very definite connection between the identity crisis that young Muslims are experiencing, and I would even say those of us who are not so young are experiencing, who've grown up in Western countries, who don't understand exactly where they belong, um, and anti-Muslim bigotry, a rise in anti-Muslim sentiment. Right now the numbers are polling about 70% of GOP voters say that Muslims should be banned or Islam shouldn't be allowed in this country. This is having a direct impact on the psyche of young Muslims because they don't know where they belong. They don't feel American. They don't feel anti-American, but they don't feel American. And that creates really fertile ground for recruitment. And I think we're lucky that we haven't seen higher numbers because when it comes down to this, when you have leading presidential candidates making statements like this, you are gonna, yesterday I was taking my daughter to school. She's 7 years old, and she said, I don't know, we were just driving, like we had the radio on, and all of a sudden she said, Mama, Trump is coming. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, well, Trump is coming, we gotta go. We have to get out of here. I mean, to this level that she's in second grade, and there are these fears, right, of not belonging. So you know, I really believe strongly that what you're seeing, and then when it comes to young girls in particular, wanting to go overseas and get married to these men they don't know, and there is a big dearth of Muslim male heroes. The Muslim man in the Western psyche, in Western media, is the rage guy. He's impotent. He treats women badly. He has no power. He can't protect anybody here. And so what they're seeing is, and I have talked to USG many times. I said, you know what we need? We need more images of Muslims in service, of Muslims in the military, of Muslims in law enforcement. They exist. Let's see them on the media. Let's see them on billboards. Let's let our young people see these images. It would not just help their sense of identity and belonging to this country, but also I think it would push back on anti-Muslim bigotry. And I think anybody who's studied any of these messages can tell you that the kinds of messages that anti-Muslim bigots give and violent extremists give, they are like an echo chamber. So ISIS will say Muslims cannot live in the West. Muslims in the West are at odds. And anti-Muslim bigots will say the same thing. They say Islam and democracy are not compatible. They're getting the exact same messages from both of these groups, and they're feeling very much alienated. So I'll stop there, and I guess we can take the rest in question. I think that's the end of it for me. So, all right, okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to have a chance to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. I want to speak a little bit about where a peace-building organization like Search for Common Ground is fitting into this broader dynamic around messaging, counter-messaging, narratives, counter-narratives within CVE right now. I want to start out though by asking, how many people here are familiar with the term propaganda of the deed? So raise your hand if you know that term. Okay, very few. Propaganda of the deed is the concept that drives terrorism. And in fact, not just terrorism, but other acts of violence by non-state actors and insurgents, and in fact, to a certain extent, by state actors as well. It's the idea that that an act of terrorism is an act of communication, right? Terrorism is by nature aimed at creating visual imagery, typically, that shows a particular message in society that goes rapidly across a population or across a bunch of populations to cause a shift in political, social, cultural dynamics. Right? So terrorism is, by its nature, no matter who it's committed by, a piece of propaganda of the deed. It's not a new thing. It's something that has existed as long as insurgencies have existed. And one of the things that's really critical to understand, and something that I think those of us in the peace building space have been just sort of starting to grapple with over the last number of years, is really understanding that insurgencies are inherently built around the notion of a strategic narrative. So if you look at kind of insurgency manuals and counterinsurgency manuals, you'll see that the starting point critically is the storyline. The storyline that an insurgency group, whatever it may be, whether you're talking about a Maoist insurgency in rural Nepal or you're talking about a global insurgency like what we're seeing with Daesh, starts with a critical story aimed at communicating a certain image of both a historical glory and some kind of possible utopian future, which taps into and sort of frames the core grievances of a population. And the traditional insurgencies, so if you look at the Maoist traditional model of insurgency, was also built on the core concept of building a popular support. So building essentially a community of people, a group of people, right, who would support that insurgency and create basically a public demand based on their core grievances. And so the essence of media, propaganda, and the tools of communication were really at the center and have been at the center of insurgencies for decades, for as long as insurgencies have operated. The essence of this is not just to create recruitment for soldiers, but also to create space in communities for insurgencies to hide, for them to operate freely, to then spread particular political, religious, or whatever ideology an insurgency is operating on, and essentially to create a foundation for essentially launching their military campaign. Media communications tools have been really at the absolute center of insurgencies for as long as insurgencies have existed. And you'll see really a wide range of the kinds of media tools traditionally. So in Nepal, for instance, the Maoist insurgency there formulated these very effective cultural artistic drama groups that traveled the country, wrote music, wrote songs, did theater, participatory theater, quite frankly, used a lot of the kinds of tools that an organization like ours, Search for Common Ground, uses. Right? And some of our colleagues there would tell us, they would attend these events. Thousands of people would come, watch these events, and they say, even people who were quite firmly anti-Maoist, quite ideologically opposed, by the time they would get through watching often would feel roused up that these guys were hitting on the core grievances of those groups, and really seeking, a way of trying to provide support. And this a sense of popular support, what's really important always for us to understand, those of us who are engaged in this now, is that it has always aimed at targeting both men and women. It's never been about targeting men and trying to engage men in insurgencies, but rather to create a whole circle, a whole community of people around essentially an armed cause. So social media has catalyzed or has enabled the catalyzation? Anyway, has been a catalyst for a real shift, a real transformation in the way in which insurgencies are actually functioning. Really, insurgencies are innovating, and innovating at a doctrinal level. Okay, what does this really look like? Al-Qaeda was the first really to conceptualize of what some people are called a global insurgency. Now, this term has generated a little bit of controversy, and you see this controversy manifest because it has been used at times to talk about and sort of sort of reinforce the anti-Muslim propaganda and anti-Muslim bigotry that we've seen around the world. But if you sort of take away that dimension of it and just recognize it as a concept of mobilizing an insurgency at a global scale, right? Whatever the ideological cause could be, it is something that really occurred. Now, the main shift that happened doctrinally is the notion of popular support. And this is where social media is so critical. So whereas in a traditional Maoist style insurgency, where community support and public support was built from the ground up, and it was really defining communities based on geographic location. So we're going to get this village and that village, and we'll be able to create, a physical space. Al-Qaeda began to conceptualize of that popular community as a virtual community, a community that existed actually based on shared identities or shared grievances that existed across dividing lines. We're seeing to a certain extent, although vastly less effectively organized, the neo-Nazi movement and extreme right white supremacist movements starting to try to replicate this model as well. And social media was the critical fundamental enabler that enabled initially Al-Qaeda to draw out those connections, de-isolate people from their space, to link them into a community of people where they could actually then launch an extremist movement. What ISIS has done is taken that insurgency innovation, and they've added the innovations of marketing, right? And really, I've met a guy who's a social media marketer, designs campaigns for Pepsi and things like that. And he was telling me that everybody is looking in their space at ISIL with envy, right? Because what they have done is they've actually taken the real shift that we've seen in the marketing space, which is away from, we all know sort of how marketing works and has worked in our lives, where the kind of core concept is touch people's lives 7 times, touch their consciousness 7 times, and eventually they'll have awareness of your product and eventually buy it. But marketers are suddenly faced with the prospect of that model simply not working. And what people are starting to do is create what they call user journeys, right? What they want to do is create entry for somebody into their product and drive them on a pathway that ultimately leads them to buying that product. So if you think about how many people here might have Nike app on their phones, you have a Nike app, you take your run, right? And then you end up posting your Nike app run time. If you run well, I don't tend to post mine, but you put your Nike app run time on your Facebook, right? Everybody sees, okay, Nike, I'm associating that with health. I'm associating that with this person who I admire who ran, 10 miles in an hour, right? And then, when it comes time, first of all, you're wearing out your shoes. Inherently, it comes time to buy shoes. Well, Nike is in your consciousness and you're going to buy it, right? And this is a user journey. And almost all major products are now sort of saying, how do we actually engage people in a process that's step-by-step incremental that ultimately leads them to buying our product? And this is what ISIL has done, right? And ISIL has essentially creating entry points for people to be able to engage on a journey that leads them ultimately to either recruitment or whatever destinations ISIS is trying to have them achieve. So what's powerful about this is that what they've marketed, it's fascinating to see sort of the imagery that you've put up. One of the ways one of the things that I've observed is that the marketing that's done from place to place is rather different. Actually, the messaging, the way in which it operates, the whole kind of structure of the message is a little bit different and tuned effectively to the core grievances, the core challenges, and the motivational factors that are driving youth behaviors in those communities, right? They combine also this core notion of a hero's journey with a user journey. So one of the things that I've seen in several different publications in Dabik, this whole notion of actually you can create an incremental process in your life to achieve heroism, right? So the image that you showed of the horseback, actually, it really struck me. It reminded me of the images of the American Special Forces in Afghanistan on horseback, right? It was a hero image, right? And what that is ultimately doing is tapping into something that we actually at Search for Common Ground consider to be one of the most critical fundamental resources for peace building, which is that power of youth, sense of injustice, the power of a sense that actually society is not as we think it should be, the power of the desire to cause change. right? Which is something that many groups that use extremism, not just ISIS, but Buddhist extremist groups and white supremacist groups are all tapping into that kind of sense of disquiet that young people often have as they become aware of the political dynamics around them. And they create the journey to do it. There's a guy I know in Norway who does prevention of recruitment. He's an extraordinary guy. And he told me, when they were really trying to understand what was going on, he said they got on Facebook to see how hard it was to then actually go to Syria. And he told me they were able in just a matter of hours to have a plane ticket to Turkey. Just a matter of hours through an engagement with a recruiter on Facebook. And so what they've also done is something that those who work in the behavior change communications field know very well. They have linked that user journey to access to the product. And it has to be rapid. Because people make decisions, and the line between making a decision to take an action or do a behavior and acting on it, the timeline is very short, and probably shorter in the modern world than ever before, right? And so, essentially, they make available that resource. There is now this whole world of counter-messaging, counter-narratives that governments and states are sponsoring. Even the whole idea of counter-narrative by itself demonstrates the powerlessness and the limitations that states are facing in trying to grapple with and confront the narratives that ISIL and any other insurgencies are putting forward. And in fact, over the course of armed conflict, of small wars, it is very, very rare that you will find any state actually putting forward saying our counter-narrative messaging approach was at the center of our victory in cases that they win. Why is this? One is that states often put forward propaganda that promotes them, okay, or promotes a very narrow line that they're seeking to push into their citizenry. And in the modern world, people are a lot less susceptible to kind of typical propaganda. Most people, even people who live in societies which are not very free and open, can smell propaganda a mile away. We all can. We all know it when we see it here. Even though we will watch particular news channels that guide us into particular attitude sets, state propaganda somehow smacks of it. And the other thing is that state actions and state propaganda typically don't align with each other. So, in other words, state propaganda of the deed or state deeds which cause resonance in their society and their messaging don't tend to align. We saw this in the United States in the way in which the U.S. sought to fight the insurgency in Iraq. The narrative was around democracy, around freedom, around self-determination of Iraqi people, around strong institutions, but the visual imagery that emerged, the most striking visual imagery that emerged from Iraq was Abu Ghraib, which gave an absolutely contradictory message, right, to what the strategic narrative of the counterinsurgency was. Where do peace builders fit into all of this, right? Because you can imagine an organization like ours that gets funding from state governments, most of whom have taken a clear side in terms of the conflict between ISIL and their broader world, and we're getting funding from the U.S. State Department, from the British, from others. How do we actually put into social media space, into the public broadcast media space, messaging that is not actually taking a propaganda line, that won't be effective, but is also not promoting, obviously, recruitment into armed groups? Where do we really fit? And we're full of a host of dilemmas and challenges around that. For us, there are three things. I would by no means claim that we have figured this all out. And in fact, I think that organizations like ours and anybody who works in the media space and has been working with youth for a long time, like as we have, are facing actually really substantial challenges around the market and the way in which people absorb information, the kind of space we can occupy in a media market, challenges that are really quite significant threats to how we actually cause behavioral change in a new way. And all of us are really trying to grapple with this. And if you can sort of think about this, that kid in Karachi, 10 years ago, if we put a television drama series up on TV about kids in Karachi, or even a radio show, that's going to be one of a handful of things that he or she would actually have access to. The influence on his or her life would be pretty substantial. It would resonate strongly. Today, if you put that same show on the air, it's going to be one of 1,000 inputs into his or her life on a daily basis, right? And social media enables rapid, fast, quick engagements that affect people in such broad ways that we're not actually yet aware of or even understand how actually people are absorbing messages. And this is a critical challenge that we're facing, in addition to the challenge of remaining fully impartial and messaging in a way that really truly resonates with populations. So there's two main things that I think we've been seeking to do. And I'm going to show you just very quickly a couple of quick examples. The first is we basically are seeking not to create counter narratives, but rather what we call citizens' narratives, or the voices of people. Put people's voices, ideas, views, their own perspectives into the professional media space and onto social media. Equip, enable people who want to have influence over their society, those same young people who are typical automatic targets by ISIL or others, create opportunities, platforms for them to get into that public space, to talk about their challenges of identity, their sense of what a right, proper, just world looks like, what kind of viewpoints they and their peers may have. What that and the other kinds of professional media outputs that we try to put out seek to achieve is really to promote pluralism, the notion that societies can be diverse and that diversity doesn't necessarily threaten your identity or practices. It promotes tolerance, and most important, in my opinion, it promotes critical thinking. And the critical thinking piece is really quite fundamental. We did a study in Nepal. In fact, our colleague who was on that project with us is here. Maybe 10 years ago, just at the end of Nepal's armed conflict, and we really wanted to understand what is it that enabled those young people who lived in communities where the Maoist insurgents were recruiting youth. What was it that enabled those who resisted to resist? And we emerged from that study with two really critical factors. Okay, one was, as one young man put it to me, he said, "Well, I ask questions." So critical thinking is about saying, "Hey, I'm not going to just accept all the things that people are telling me. I'm going to ask questions about it and understand how my behavior aligns to my interests." And the second thing was around belonging to groups, connections, volleyball teams, youth clubs, youth networks, different kinds of structured groups. In that context, those two factors then basically fueled a media initiative that we put into place for years, aiming to address those two critical factors. From there, I wanted to show you two quick videos. They're just a couple minutes. One is actually from a commercial, because actually advertisers have huge influence and maybe much more power and influence than a peace building group like ours would have, right? And it's just an example of this promotion of tolerance and how that kind of message can be injected into society. It's an Indian commercial, right?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction. And I just want to publicly thank USIP for having me be part of the team here for the last 8 to 9 months as an Army fellow, being one of a handful of military folks here in the building. It's been an honor to be here. So thank you. Um, I am a public affairs practitioner. That's what I do in the Army full time. But I chose to study something a little bit different, to be outside of my comfort zone, and that was women who engage in terrorist activity or who willingly join violent extremist organizations. And so I found that topic very fascinating, very interesting, and it was because of all the media coverage of women's involvement in terrorist groups that a lot of media, whether it be social media, traditional media, have been, the narrative has been those poor women. Women are victims. Women were coerced. The man made her do it. It's never been women as a combatant, women as the perpetrator. That's always been kind of the second, third consequence of story coverage. The leading story has always been, or the leading tagline has been, women was coerced, or she's a victim, or how could she leave her family? A man must have made her do it. Instead of thinking about women actively engaging, having a direct role in terrorist activity. So that's what I chose to study over these last 8 to 9 months. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and talk a little bit, it's tied to both with what Michael and Rabia have talked about in some way, shape, or form. So, so the main question I looked at, what draws women to violent extremist groups? And I'll talk a little bit about my methodology. I'll talk about the 3 case studies I chose to research, but I'll give you a little bit of the overall context first. As instability in the world is increasing, non-nation states are becoming more powerful. We need to recognize the role women are actively playing in terrorist organizations so we can better prepare ourselves. From a Department of Defense perspective, from a national security perspective, internationally, from just U.S. to Europe with NATO, to all the different countries I think that are being effective globally with terrorist organizations, the actions that terrorist organizations are conducting right now. Throughout history, women have conducted violent acts and have participated in violent extremist groups, insurgencies, and revolutionary organizations. I can only imagine the impact of some of the groups I studied would have if social media was active or created back in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s with some of these groups. The impact would have just been incredible. It would have been amazing. I looked at some of the groups. When you look at the history of women's organizations or women that have participated in organizations, you have the Baader-Meinhof Brigade out of Germany. That was created by women. They were very active in the 60s and 70s. They were responsible for several bombings that killed citizens, military, and U.S. soldiers in Germany. You look at the PKK, the IRA, the ELN, the Sandinistas in the 1960s, they had 25 to 30% women in their organizations. Shining Path had 40%. The People's Liberation Front for Palestine, one of their most famous terrorists was a woman by the name of Layla Khalid, who hijacked TWA Flight 840 in 1969. She became like the poster woman for recruitment for that organization and the role women played in that organization. You also have the Weather Underground, which was a U.S. organization. It was a revolutionary youth movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. So, why have we not recognized the impact of women, the deadly effectiveness of women, and on security and on society? Why do we not consider women a threat? Why do we have these preconceived notions that when we think of a terrorist, our first thought goes, it's a male, late teens, early 20s? We don't think that it could be a woman. And when we hear it's a woman, we just kind of dismiss it, and it's almost like that shock, like, oh my God. So I've just noticed that in media coverage, especially over this last year. When you think about over the last year what's happened in our world, we had the Paris attacks. Initial follow-up coverage with the Paris attacks was widespread coverage from Paris when we thought a 26-year-old woman detonated a suicide vest. Everybody kept reporting this is the first female suicide bomber, and I'm sitting there going, no, it's not, no, it's not. And then it came out that no, she didn't have a suicide vest. We were wrong. But everybody was leading with that fact. They were just shocked that a woman could be a suicide bomber. With the San Bernardino attacks, Media reports were just, couldn't understand what would drive a woman to be radicalized and have this couple leave their baby with their grandparents. But I picked up on, I don't know if anybody else noticed, for the first 48, 72 hours, pictures had her husband up there, and they had a blacked out silhouette of her. They didn't show her picture for days. And I was just sitting there going, why aren't we showing her picture? Why are we so shocked that a woman could leave her child and lead her husband to do this act of violence? So just those two incidents alone just helped kind of validate my research and got me just more energized to finish my project while I've been here. When we analyze women's motivations to join these groups, whether it's a terrorist, political, or a radical movement, many analysts tend to believe women are coerced, they're victims of men, rather than the possibility of an alternate explanation. There's a more sophisticated, nuanced, complex set of factors to explain why women join these groups. So when I looked at my research, I found Dr. Mia Bloom's 4R+1 framework. I use that as my methodology, and I just love reading anything that Dr. Bloom did, listening to her speak and her interviews she did. And I really focused on her 4R+1 framework, and that's revenge, could be the loss of a loved one. Redemption, that's the forgiveness of past sins, and we find that many suicide bombers use redemption as a reason for joining a group. Relationship tends to be the most common, and that goes for men and women. It could be, a family member, a boyfriend, girlfriend, a spouse that's part of this organization that would cause someone to join. Respect. With women, I've found in my case studies, respect was a lot of reasoning why women join these groups, and it was because they want to be respected. They want to show they are just as dedicated to the cause as men, as the young men in their tribe or village or in their city. And rape is the other R. And so when you look at rape as a cause or a reasoning or a factor to join, it's because in a lot of cultures, once a woman is raped, they are unable to go back to their family, to go back to their village. So what are they going to do? A lot of women have no choice but, I'm going to be part of this group. They're going to welcome me into my family. I can't go home to my family. Or on the flip side, organizations use this as a recruiting tool. So they know the woman can't go home, so they say, come with us. But they're also cause for raping women to get them to join their organization, which is, like I said, it's the other side of the coin when you look at the rape as a factor. Also, with the case studies I studied, women were assaulted by the enemy of the organization. Could be by the government, could be by the military, and that caused them, they needed protection. So that's why they also joined the group. So all of those 4+1, all of those could be a reason for a woman to join a group. There could be a combination of factors, but I did find at least 2 to 3 of the R's in the case studies that I studied and researched were the reason why women join these groups. The case studies I looked at, I hope you're familiar with some of them. The LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam out of Sri Lanka, the Chechen Black Widows, and the FARC. 3